Welcome to MarshWatch number 7, 7 of 10. I can't believe we're this far through them already. I'm coming at you today in Saskatoon, which is on the Treaty 6 territory, which encompasses the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis people. And it happens to be my home too. I quite like it here. My name is Leanne Latromoy, and I know there's some of you who are still registering for this, so I'm going to keep giving my little spiel. My name's Leanne. I love wetlands. I started with Birds Canada in 2008, working for a graduate student surveying least bitterns in southern Ontario, and I've been hooked on marshes ever since, and I've been with Birds Canada for the most part ever since, and it's a real pleasure to be able to work for this company. We're a not-for-profit organization, and our mission is to drive action to increase understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada, as well as their habitats. So hopefully I can impart some of my enthusiasm for all of our wetland critters to you. And if you're tuning in for the first time, there's a whole backlog of videos for you to catch up on if you want to. They're available. They'll always be up. We're not planning on taking anything down, so you can always go back and check. Okay, on the agenda for this evening, we've got a bunch of birds. Those are going to be recorded and posted online, and then afterwards, we'll turn the recording off and we can get to the quizzes and discussions, and you can ask me anything you want. Okay, our birds today. This is going to be a study, for the most part, in pairs of species that look a lot alike. So first on deck, we've got two wrens, the Marsh Wren and the Sedge Wren. Then we're going to kind of break it up a little bit. We got the common yellowthroat, which is the most common warbler in a wetland setting, the northern harrier, which is the one raptor we're covering, and we've got common and Forster's terns, which look pretty similar, as well as the willet and the marbled godwit, structurally kind of similar. And if you're, not used to looking at shorebirds, they can definitely look pretty similar to you. So hopefully after today, we can help to demystify a few of these pairs of species that do look quite similar. Okay, first off, Marsh Wren and Sedge Wren. These are the two wrens that you're going to be finding in a wetland context for the most part. Of course, there's other wrens that could be, in the brambles on the side and things, but Marsh Wren and Sedge Wren, they need wetland habitats. So Marsh Wren, as the name suggests, they're often found in deeper water wetlands, and Sedge Wren tends to be found in shallower water wetlands. But this is by no means a hard and fast rule. Just because you have sedges doesn't mean you have a Sedge Wren, and just because you have deep water cattails, doesn't mean that a Sedge Wren can't be in that too. So there's a little bit of play there. They're not stuck in between those two habitats. And sometimes people get hung up. They look at the habitat and they go, sedges must be a sedge wren, but we'll help to demystify that for you. Wrens overall are small, teeny tiny little balls of energy. They're small, they bounce around, and they're almost continually singing. So if you have either of these wrens in a wetland, you are absolutely going to hear them. The thing you might not be able to do is spot them. They're small, they're furtive, and they don't always make themselves very visible. Especially the marsh wren, which tends to like, oftentimes the deeper water stuff, it's going to be a ways away. So maybe you saw a small blur of something brown, but that's pretty much all you're going to be able to tell unless it starts singing and then are able to track it. So small birds, feisty, they scramble around in the vegetation a lot, and they both often have their tails, sticking straight up. That's a lovely characteristic of the wrens. It makes them look really adorable. So let's tackle the marsh wren first. Small, compact. It's relatively long-billed compared to the sedge wren, but that's not really something that you're gonna be able to tell in the field. I know I wouldn't be able to tell that in the field just by the silhouette of it. Both sexes look the same, and they're kind of a rusty brown overall. There's a rusty patch on the wing, and that's going to be helpful when you're comparing it to the sedge wren. The sedge wren is going to have much more barring on the wing. So marsh wren has that kind of blob of rusty color. And the thing that stands out is that little white eyebrow, that supercilium. Much as we've talked about in the ducks, that this holds true for other birds as well. White is something that really stands out at a distance. Colors can get muddied, and depending on the quality of light, all kinds of colors can kind of distort and give you you know, a false read on what that color might be. But white doesn't really do that. White usually stands out quite well, especially in low light conditions. So that nice little white eyebrow with a nice little dark cap makes it really stand out for the marsh wren. These guys are cute, they're feisty, they've got nice barred tails, and otherwise, little palish throat, but really it's going to be that little white eyebrow if you do get a glimpse of it, and that kind of blob of color, like it's more like the absence of the rest of the barring on the wing for the marsh wren right there. These guys glean all kinds of things off of, the vegetation. They're going for insects, aquatic insects, spiders, anything that could be running around and going. They don't really eat, plant matter or anything. They're mostly grabbing little tiny insects. You'll find them in wetlands that often have cattail and bulrushes, and they do tend to prefer deeper water wetlands than sedge wrens, but sometimes, as the summer goes on, the water levels recede a fair bit, and so, you might wind up seeing a marsh wren in a place where it's rather dry, you might think, but, in the spring it might have been a fair bit deeper. And you can see in this bottom photo here, at a distance, it's a little bit blurry, it's not you're seeing it more like you would in the field, you can still see that kind of contrasting white eyebrow. It really does stand out on the face of the bird, especially because they've got that nice little dark cap. And again, that tail sticking up, you're not going to confuse it with the sparrow because of that. They really do, stick their tails up a fair bit. And again, they're going to be singing almost nonstop. They make little neat nests. They make kind of a globe of whatever, vegetation is around, whether that be rushes or cattails, and they build multiple nests. We don't actually know why that is. It's thought to be potentially, as a predator deterrent. If a predator goes in and keeps, finding nothing in all of these nests, maybe they're less likely to check them out in the future. It could also be to, impress a mate, like, hey, ladies, look at all the houses I've built. I'm the most industrious wren. We don't really know. They don't answer our questions super well, but what's interesting is that you will, if you're out in a wetland, you will find, multiples of these kind of dome ball-shaped nests, and those are going to be your little marsh wren nests. Sedge wrens do a very similar nest as well. And we're going to do a fair bit of comparing of the songs in a little bit, so I'll just play it for you now so we can get a little bit of a taste of it, but we're going to do a bit of a study on it in a little bit here. So they have kind of a variable gurgling rattle. They often have a buzzy introduction note. To me, it almost sounds like they're taking a breath, like, and then going into their gurgling sound. So, oops. Managed to hit my mouse there. Okay, I'll play the song for you now. Hopefully that's loud enough. I think my headphones are dying on me. I had trouble in our meeting today. So it's a variable gurgling rattle. Let's see. Okay, nobody's. Okay, play it once more. Okay. Good. I'm glad you guys are getting the sound. I need to get new headphones tonight. Marsh wrens have a fairly wide distribution. Of course, you're going to find them across the northern Great Plains here, but you'll also get them down into the US and in eastern Canada as well. You get sometimes the odd ones that show up in the Maritime provinces, but there aren't a whole lot of them out there. Okay, next up is the sedge wren. The sedge wren has a lot of the same characteristics. It's going to be sticking that tail up in the air a fair bit, going to be climbing around the vegetation and singing away. They're quite small, very compact, and it does have a shorter bill than, than the marsh wren friend. Both sexes look the same, and overall, it's really going to be kind of plain and streaky and a little bit paler in color tone. It's not going to be quite as rich, rusty brown. Overall, it's a bit more straw colored. And while there is a bit of an eyebrow stripe, it doesn't contrast sharply with the rest of the face. If you were to if you squint your eyes at the screen and try to blur your vision a little bit, the eyebrow doesn't really jump out at you the way it does in the marsh wren. And so that's something to keep in mind if you're able to see that contrasting eyebrow stripe, that kind of supercilium above the eye. You're dealing with a marsh wren. If it's sort of there, but it's not really standing out, you're starting to think sedge wren. And again, on the wing is kind of, similarly stripy and variable in, all those little patternings the whole way through. There's not this kind of blob of, solid color on the wing. The whole wing is kind of stripy and splotchy. They do prefer shallower wetlands, so oftentimes you'll find them in areas that have dense sedges and grasses on the margins of wetlands, wet meadows, and sometimes in hay fields. So they can do a little bit drier, but again, I have seen sedge wrens and marsh wrens occupying the same habitat, so it's not a hard and fast rule. You tend to find them in drier habitats than marsh wrens, generally speaking. This is another one that's going to have the same diet. They're going to be gleaning insects and prey off of, the vegetation surrounding them. So they're going to go after a whole bunch of insects and spiders. And I don't have a picture of the nest because I haven't actually found any. But the nest is another globe-shaped ball of rushes, cattails, sedges, grasses, whatever. And they do also build multiple. So the sedge wren song, it's a bit more harsh and sewing machine like. It's much more mechanical in its sounds. There's a few introductory notes that kind of chit, 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 and then they have much more of a mechanical rattle that to me really sounds like a sewing machine going. So let's play the song here. So that those couple of intro notes, and then the rest of the rattle is really kind of clean, mechanical, and dry sounding. Just imagine somebody's at a sewing machine. I'll play it once more for us, and we'll get into some studying soon. Sedge wrens don't have as quite a broad distribution, but you're still going to find them across a fair bit of the prairies, as well as southern Ontario and parts of southern Quebec as well, and into parts of the States. Okay, so looking at the two side by side, again, that white eyebrow really contrasts on the face of the marsh wren. That nice dark cap really highlights that kind of bold white eyebrow where, the rest of the face on the sedge wren, it's pretty plain overall. There's no dark cap. We don't have a really high contrast eye stripe, so much more plain looking overall. And again, on the wing, on the marsh wren, there's this kind of just blob of no pattern on it, just a blob of rustiness, whereas the sedge wren really is going to have that kind of streaking and barring all over the wing in its entirety. So both of them overall, you're much more likely to hear than you are to see. Sometimes, they'll do little flight calls where they'll, sing as they fly and then drop down, but for the most part, you never get a satisfying look at these two unless you happen to be like, in a canoe or a kayak, like sitting in a marsh and just like letting nature happen. Then you might get a good look at them because, they're kind of bold and kind of curious. So for the most part, unless you're like really in the wetland, they can be tough to lay your eyes on. So this is why listening to the sounds is really helpful. So I'm going to go straight to the next slide because I've got some spectrograms up. So I introduced spectrograms a couple of weeks ago, and it's essentially a way of looking at sound over time. So imagine the x-axis here is time, the y-axis. So as you go up here, you go up in frequency. So this is high frequency sounds up here, and at the bottom, they're low frequency sounds. And the intensity of the color is the loudness of the sound. So we've got both marsh wren and sedge wren here, and they do look a little bit different. The rattle portion looks pretty similar if you're zoomed out on it. So they do both have a rattle. The rattle itself is more variable in the marsh wren. An individual can have multiple types of rattles, and you can, dive deep and really get nerdy about it and really look at what they might be doing, but they have a more complex song. It's more liquid, it's more rich, it's more musical. The sedge wren, on the other hand, really has much more of a dry kind of staccato song to it. The rattle really is very, very dry. And you can see these intro notes. We've got that tick, 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 and then it's followed by the rattle. And here's another one, tick, 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 followed by that rattle. On the marsh wren, you can kind of see that little buzzy note that leads off that rattle portion. So it's a bit of a short, short buzz. To me, like I said, it sounds a little bit like it's taking a deep breath, like, and then it goes into its rattle. So there's a few going on here. There's one individual that's relatively close, and then another one that's farther away. Same thing with the the Sedge Wren here. Here's another one in the background that you can sort of see. It's masked a little bit by some other calls, but spectrograms can be really handy. And in the emails that I send out afterwards, the Peterson Guide to Bird Sounds, they do a really good job of showing you the spectrogram as you're playing, and that can just be a way to kind of help train your ear, because sometimes if you're not terribly musical, it can be hard to, know if like, okay, the next few notes are rising in pitch or decreasing in pitch. We're not all of us are good at kind of hearing that on our own, but sometimes if you see it, it kind of helps to bring that point home. So for me, I do find looking at the spectrograms kind of helpful. So we will play a short snippet of the spectrogram. So here's a marsh wren. So we're going to hear marsh wren here, 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 and another one at the very end of it, as well as other birds in the background. So hopefully some of those birds are going to start to be familiar to you, but for now, just try to pick out the marsh wren. So we got a little bit of an intro kind of buzz or inhale, and then kind of a gurgly mechanic or gurgly rattle. Okay, let's play it. Okay, I hope that was loud enough. Like I said, I'm hearing less and less on my end. So there's several marsh wrens going as well as other birds, and they, as you can see from the call frequency, there's a few individuals here. There's at least three. They go pretty regularly. They don't take breaks for the most part. Wrens are, they feel like one of the busiest birds that I've ever seen. They just seem to always be calling. They'll do it. They'll call at night. They'll call during the day. They'll call in the morning. They'll call in the evening. It's kind of incredible just how much wrens call. So let's play that again as the spectrogram's going. You can see that little bar is our where we're at in time. So hit that play button again. The wrens call all the time but never leave a message. I like that. They are very busy, and Robin's pointing out you can hear American bittern on that. There's a red-winged blackbird that calls. There's some snipe that are calling throughout this, and there's just some little chit notes, and I'm not sure, that might be a yellowthroat, but I'm not sure on that one. So we'll go and take a listen to the sedge wren now. We've got a sedge wren calling. So again, here's those few intro notes and that rattle, few intro notes and the rattle, few intro notes and the rattle. There's a couple of, there's probably about 3 or so here. There's 2 that are relatively close, and then there's one that's kind of a little bit farther away. And I know we haven't covered the LeConte sparrow yet, but this call right here is a LeConte sparrow, and this other one is a LeConte sparrow, and here's another one. So let's take a listen. I will make sure to bump up the volume. Oh, it's already going. Hang on. Okay. So it sounds a bit more mechanical, a bit more sewing machine rattly, and those few intro notes, they're actually quite distinct. Like you can hear them. Sometimes, when a bird sings an intro note, it's kind of quiet and you don't always hear it. The marsh wren can sort of be like that. If you get, a little bit farther away from the marsh wren, you can kind of lose that intro note. So it just sounds more like a gurgling rattle. But the sedge wren, they really put emphasis on those intro notes. Let's play it again. That one's quieter, hey? Well, I'll make sure to post these online when I upload the, the video, and you guys can take a listen. it'll hopefully come out better over YouTube, and if you can get some good headphones, try doing with those as well. But that's the difference between the Marsh Wren and the Sedge Wren. They sound sort of similar, but there are little differences to pick them apart, and as well, they do look quite similar together. So hopefully I've demystified the wrens a little bit for you, and you can feel a little bit more confident practicing. But if not, everybody's going to be impressed if you say, "Oh, that's a wren." Maybe your non-working friends, because it's still a feat to get to that, level of identification. You're kind of choosing between two species for the most part. So don't worry if they sound similar to you. Practice, practice, practice. Okay, take a sip of water here. Next up, we have the common yellowthroat. Common yellowthroats are often found in wetlands. They're not exclusively found in wetlands. On the prairies, you can actually find them in areas of kind of low shrubbery in large pastures, which threw me for a loop the first time I heard them there. But oftentimes they like that kind of dense habitat that wetlands create. So they're a small little warbler. And if you've ever tried to look at warblers before, you'll know that warblers are also extremely active. They're hard to keep your binoculars on because they don't sit still very often. They keep bouncing around from one perch to the other. They'll sing. Sometimes you can get them singing from a perch for a little bit, but oftentimes they're very, very active. Warblers have kind of small little pointed bill, and they use that like a forceps to collect insects. So males and females do look different in the species, and the males are the one that you're most likely to see. The females are really kind of secretive, and you wind up seeing them a fair bit less. The males also stand out. They have this lovely bandit mask across their face, this great big dark mask, really, really bold. It contrasts with everything else on the body, and you don't often just see like a brown bird with a big flash of, dark jet black on it. So that black face mask really stands out, and it's actually kind of highlighted and accentuated by that kind of pale whitish grayish edge above the mask. So really does stand out. And as the name suggests, they do have this lovely, gorgeous yellow throat. Super, super handsome little bird. Otherwise, the wings are plain, there's no barring on them, and they're kind of this kind of dull olive brown on top. The rest of their lower body gets a little bit paler, but this is one that you don't almost ever see from below. A lot of other warblers, you're stuck looking at them in a tree canopy, so you get really good at trying to ID the underside of warblers. The common yellowthroat is a bit of an exception to that. You, for the most part, see them head on or from a little bit above. And the males sing a song that, for whatever reason, my brain likes to filter out. So I have to actually actively listen for them because they kind of just blend into the background for me. But they sing versions of witchity, 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 witch, or witchy, 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 sort of those kind of songs. They're really quite adorable in their songs. So here, we'll play the witchy, witchy. Play it once more for you. And they'll often do that witchy, witchy, witchy kind of 3.5 to 4 times, and then they'll repeat that as another song series. The females are quite drab, and it's hard to get a good photo of them. There's not a ton that I've found. I think some of these might even be juvenile birds in the fall, but it's really tough to get a picture of a female common yellowthroat because they are rather secretive. They skulk around in the vegetation. They definitely don't make themselves, easily seen. And because they're a warbler, they don't sit still for very long. So if you do get to see one, it's only a quick glimpse. But they have a similar shape overall to the male, and they do have a yellowish throat. They're kind of drab olive brown all over for the most part, and they'll have variable amounts of that kind of white on the throat. Sometimes, like in this bird over here, it's more just pale looking with a kind of tinge of yellow, and other times, it really does look a fair bit more yellow. The throat, however, contrasts with the rest of the face, and the face is mostly pretty plain. There's a little bit of an eye-ring that you can see on their face, but the face is, there isn't a whole bunch on it to write home about. Fairly plain, but that throat really does still contrast with the darker coloration on the face. So you still get that nice contrast line between the throat coloration and the rest of the head. So that is the female common yellowthroat. They are tough to see because they definitely don't make themselves available. You'll often find these guys, like I said, in wetlands that have, all kinds of vegetation in them. And if you get into some of the bigger stretches of prairie, you might also find them in sort of those little coulees that have little shrubs and things in them. So keep an eye out in those locations as well. Not strictly a wetland species. They're another gleaner. Warblers are famous for using their little forceps-like bill to get spiders and insects off of vegetation. And again, dense, low vegetation, primarily wetlands. So that male, really, really handsome, and that bandit mask really stands out at a distance. So hopefully this is a warbler that you'll get to see a little bit more of. Definitely has a very wide distribution, so this is a species that pretty much all of us are likely to encounter on a regular basis, if we're out looking for them, of course. Okay, our raptor. So we have the northern harrier, and northern harriers are a wetland specialist. They forage by cruising low over open fields and wet areas. They're a medium-sized raptor. They're not, they're not huge, but they're they're not like a small falcon or anything either. So they're a decently sized bird. And overall, they have a slender look to them. Males and females look different. We'll cover the male first. They tend to have these kind of long, narrow wings and this long tail. And the thing that is the dead giveaway for harriers, both sexes, they're going to show this white rump patch. And because they tend to cruise low over fields and wetlands, this is a raptor that you're actually likely to see, the top side of. A lot of raptors, you're almost stuck, seeing them half the time from below. The northern harrier is often going to give you looks at its back because they do cruise super low over fields, kind of swaying back and forth. So at some point, you're likely to be able to see that white rump. Overall, though, that tail is quite long, and the wings are kind of longish and fairly narrow. The males are this kind of blue-gray overall. They have a white underwing with dark wingtips and dark edges to the feathers on the bottom here. Their head is mostly like kind of this bluish color, and there's a little bit of speckling that goes on the white belly. But again, the dead giveaway is really going to be that white patch. It is almost certainly going to be visible to you at some point if you see a northern harrier. And northern harriers have a facial disc much like owls do. So they don't have the typical raptor-looking head. They do have a ring of feathers that goes around, and it makes them look a little bit flat-headed in flight because of that little disc shape. Here are some female northern harriers. Overall, they are more, brown and plain looking, but again, that white rump really does stand out. Again, like I've said with the ducks over and over, the white really, really stands out at a distance, and the same is true for the northern harrier rump. It'll often give you the chance to take a look at it. The females, again, brownish overall. The undersides are kind of this warm, rusty brown color. The underside of their wings kind of fairly striped and buffy color. And the dark head contrasts with the lighter rest of the body. So that is our lovely female. And one of my favorite, raptors, just because they do spend so much time in wetlands, and they will nest on the ground in drier parts of the wetland. The only harrier nest that I've ever seen, I came across it doing some wetland surveys, and all of a sudden you've got angry parents, and you look down, it's like, oh, here's a nest in amongst the cattails. The cattails had dried up a fair bit, probably a year or two prior, but the cattails were still hanging on, but it was, lovely dry ground for them to build their nest on. So definitely a wetland species, and they also, really like to cruise over fields. So you'll see them over crop fields especially, and yeah, just a really common sight in the summertime. They also have quite a wide distribution, so this is a raptor that you're likely to encounter. Whew. Okay, so next we've got a couple of terns. We covered the black tern a few weeks ago, and that one was the easy one. Black body, silver wings, there's kind of nothing else that looks like it here in North America. However, that is not the same for the common and Forster's terns. As you can gather by this collection of images, they do look quite similar. Terns in general, they're kind of like the sleeker, sexier cousin to gulls. They have, lovely pointed wings, long pointed bills. They're just a bit more elegant than gulls are, and gulls are their cousins. They're more closely related to them than they are to most other species. So they do have that kind of gull-like quality, but they are much sleeker and narrower winged. And if you were to say to me, Leanne, those two photos look the same, um, you'd, you'd be reasonable in saying so. I just want to point out that these two species, they look a lot alike, and when you're identifying them, it's often on kind of subtle differences. And I will tell you right now that it is not always possible to identify these two species. There are plenty of times where a tern goes by and it just did not give me the right looks to figure out what it was. So don't feel bad. This is a thing that happens, and you absolutely can't always tell. I'm sure there's some absolute tern experts, and maybe they're able to tell with better frequency than I am. But just all that to say, don't stress out if you find these two birds really similar, because they are. So hopefully we can break them down. We'll start with the common tern, and we're going to be going back and forth between the two species. So they're both similarly sized, and they both have, gray upper parts, white underparts for the most part, and this little black cap. Common tern, their bill is going to be reddish for the most part with a dark tip. Forster's tern is going to be tending towards more of the orangey, but this isn't the most reliable way to tell them apart. It's more, can be used as a supporting character if you get, the right looks at them. So one of the things to be able to tell them in flight is looking at the top color of the body. So in common tern, the upper back color is going to be similar overall to the rest of the wing. I just want to point out that these are birds in breeding plumage. That's what we're going to be covering here. We can throw in other plumages and bring in some complication, but we're really just going to keep it to the breeding plumages here. So nice kind of consistent color. So common, continuous, common, consistent, whatever you need to use to work in your head, that kind of gray color is going to translate down the rest of the wing, and you will see that nice gray color kind of throughout. The Forster's is going to kind of fade to white, and we'll see that in a second here. There can be a variable dark wedge in the primaries, but again, that can be variable and it's not always seen. They do have a gray belly, but it's a really light gray belly, and it's the kind of thing that the stars have to align for you to be able to, to make out that it does have a gray belly, because a shadow can cast a gray cast on the underside of it as well. So it's the sort of thing if, the bird's turned just right and the light is actually hitting the undersides of it and you do see kind of that slightly gray belly, that's when it can be helpful. So you can see it on this perched bird here, that bottom of the belly just has a kind of grayish tinge to it. If you want to contrast that with the white closer up to the face and the throat, as your eye goes down, it does get a little bit darker before you get to the shadowy bits. And the tail, I'll cover both of them side by side in a little bit, but for the most part, the tail is really useful, I think, for the most part, only if you're looking at photographs. So the tail shows dark on the outer tail feathers, and it's white on the inner tail feathers, so you get that little tiny line. But I'm telling you, when you're seeing them in person, in real life, as they're like zipping across, because they do fly quite fast, it's almost impossible to tell where that gray is on those outer tail feathers. So that's kind of something that if you're into photography, it can be helpful to pinpoint it. These guys nest on a variety of water bodies. large ones, small ones, and they will build their nests on little scrapes in the ground. Take a sip of water here first. Next up, we have the Forster's Tern, very similar in size to the common, similar shape overall, slender wings, forked tail. They have more of an orangey tinge to their bill, which again, is useful if you get the right lighting. Nice black cap. And the top of the wings, so the kind of back area, fades to kind of silvery whitish on the primary. So there is a contrast between the upper back color and the rest of the wing as it kind of fades into white. So you can think common, continuous, Forester, fade. Eventually they're going to rename the Forester's Tern, I'm sure, and my handy trick will go out the window. But for now, we can still use Forester, fade. They do have a white belly, but like I said, depending on the light, their belly can often be shadowed and superficially look gray. So that can be, again, sometimes useful, sometimes not super helpful. And the tail shows dark on the inner feathers, and overall, the upper parts of the tail are grayer. They're more white in the common tern, but again, that is quite subtle. Forster's terns, they breed in wetlands and they nest on floating vegetation or muskrat lodges. So a little bit different in where they nest, but these guys will fly, quite a long distance to get food. So you're not necessarily seeing them in their nesting habitat per se. They will, go on quite long foraging journeys to get food. So that's just to give you an idea of where they like to nest. Doesn't necessarily tie into where you're likely to see them. Again, you can see in this bottom picture here as this bird is stretching its wings, nice dark upper back, fading into kind of whitish silvery colors. Here's another look at it from above, that kind of dark back fading to white, Forester fade. Okay, the easiest way to tell them apart is actually if these birds are perched. So if you see them, hanging out on a rock or a post or something in a wetland or in a lake, that is going to be the easiest way to tell them apart in the breeding season for two reasons. First, the primaries on the common tern, especially when folded up, they look dark. So we're talking about these feathers. These are the primary feathers. So when nice and folded, they do look quite dark, and that does contrast with kind of the grayish upper body, these nice dark flight feathers, those nice primaries there. In the Forester's tern, I guess I lost my little arrows. The primaries are more of a silvery white color, so the wing is folded up, and instead of contrasting dark with the rest of the body, those wingtips, they look nice and pale compared to the rest of the upper wing. The tail length is also different in these two species, and it's noticeable when they're perched. Really not terribly useful when the bird is flying around, I find, but as they're perched, the wingtips of the common tern are going to extend past the tail. So here are the tail feathers down here, and the wingtip is extending well beyond where the tail feathers get you. And the Forester's tern, their tail is longer than the primary feathers. So here's the very tip of the tail feather, and there's the end of the primary. So in the common, tail is shorter, and the Forester's, the tail is longer than the rest of the wings. If you happen to see them together, you could notice that, the common tern tends to have shorter looking legs than the Forester's tern, but that's something that's really only noticeable if the two are together. There is a difference in their calls, and again, it's another one of those subtle differences. The common tern tends to have more of a two-parted song or call, and they can make a variety of calls, but usually I try to listen to, hopefully they're vocalizing and you're hearing more and more of them. So the common has two-parted, it goes more like key-er, whereas so the common goes key-er, the Forester's kind of has one syllable, key-er. So let's play those for you. I'll make sure to bump up the volume. Okay. Here, here. And the Forester's just more of a one syllable drawn out here. I'll play it again. The key-er. versus Kier. Ah. So for the most part, the sounds are quite similar. They're raspy sounding. They're a little bit, I hate to say annoying sounding because I they don't annoy me, but it's more of a grating call. You know, it's coming from above and you're hearing these kind of harsh calls. Oh, I guess I did have it. They just happened to be animated on this one. Anyway, here are my arrows. Okay, let's look at these guys side by side. So Common and Foresters. Common has the continuous color from the dark of the upper back down to the wingtips, more of a continuous coloration. The Foresters has more of a fade to kind of paler wingtips, so nice and dark on the back and paler out towards the wingtips. If you see the belly in, you know, good lighting condition, it's gray on Common and white on Foresters. And the bills, again, I like to use that more as a supporting characteristic. I wouldn't just say, oh, it's got a red bill because it, you know, it's red, therefore it must be common. It's pretty subtle, that difference, and really, you know, the lighting that you're birding in and where you're at, where colors are reflecting back to you, all plays into having those subtleties kind of muddled. And again, like red and kind of orangey are very similar anyway, and so they're very prone to getting mixed up. So again, something that you might want to use as a supporting characteristic, but not necessarily as the linchpin in anything at all. Let's take a look at those outer tail feathers. Again, I just want to stress that this is something that's mostly useful in photos. So if you're a photographer, this can sometimes help, but really, I haven't found this to be something that I go to in the field just because it's such a fine difference. Like it can really, you know, yeah, it doesn't necessarily look cut and dry in the field, but if you do manage to snap a photo, that can sometimes be helpful. So Common Tern, the dark is on the outside edge and the white coloration is on the inside edge, and it's reversed in the Forester's Tern, so those kind of long edge tail feathers are white on the outer edge and dark on the inner edge. A picture like this, you get a little bit of a sense for the tail being, you know, longer in the Forester's Tern. Again, that's another one of those things that's really, really tough as the bird is zipping. They do fly really fast and they can be here and gone in a flash. So they don't necessarily give you all the time in the world to look at them. Like I said, it's not always possible to tell which one they are. I find, especially here in Saskatchewan, I see both of them, you know, fairly regularly at a lot of wetlands. You will wind up seeing foresters more on some of those small water bodies just because they tend to nest in wetlands, so they're slightly more likely to be there, but I will see, you know, both of these species regularly out on larger bodies of water foraging as well. So it can sometimes help a little bit, you know, add another clue, but just taking a look at these two photos here, that bill color looks pretty identical. So just helps to drive the point home of bill color can be kind of a terrible clue, if you will. And one of the neat things, they're fun to watch. They forage by plunging headfirst into water, and they tuck their wings back right at the last moment, and they just torpedo into the water, and they do that in search of fish. So it's really neat to see them forage. It's very different than the black tern that we saw previously. Black terns flutter around and they kind of pick stuff off of the top of the water. So these guys definitely do make a big splash when they get into the water. It's kind of fun to watch them. They'll often, you know, go in and fly back out, and then they'll kind of shake the water off of them, and hopefully they come up with a fish because I'm sure that's kind of exhausting, but must be kind of fun. I think I would enjoy being a bird. Common terns have a wide distribution across a fair chunk of North America. Forster's terns have slightly narrower distribution. You do get them on the Great Lakes. I remember one summer we were doing marsh bird surveys around Long Point. We found a Forster's tern colony, and that was kind of exciting because it's not a common occurrence out that way. So you do get them a little bit back east, but kind of the northern Great Plains are some of the heartland of the Forster's tern distribution. Phew. Okay. Only two more species to go, and they're they're less similar than everything we've covered before. So first up, we've got the willet. The willet is a large shorebird. It has a dark, straight bill, and it's kind of, dull gray overall. It's mostly one color. It does get darker towards the tip, but we'll compare it to the Godwit in a second here that has very much a two-toned bill. So Willet, very kind of a cool gray overall. There's none of those warm tones. It's like very, very cold gray coloration. There is a bit of a pale eye-ring, but kind of the most remarkable thing about it, like this, is that it's kind of unremarkable. Dull, kind of long dark bill, very just kind of almost camouflaged gray plumage, dull kind of legs, but when it flashes its wings, and sometimes it'll give you a good stretch as they're, hanging out on a wetland, suddenly there's high contrast black and white. So their wings are really, really useful. In flight, they stand out. Again, anything that's that super high contrast, white really stands out, black can really stand out. So these guys have both of those going on. There's this nice kind of white stripe through the wing, and the very tip of the wing has a fair bit of dark on it as well. So they're quite handsome. But very, very nondescript as they're tootling around and walking around the wetlands. So you kind of look at it and you go, ooh, that is a very plain, largish shorebird. Everything about it is kind of gray until it flashes its wings. So that can be useful. Yellow legs is another shorebird that you'll see, especially, mostly during the migration season. They'll have yellow legs. And so the willet really does stand out because as it looks, it's just like kind of monotone gray everywhere. Bill, body, and legs, just cool gray. And again, that flash. Willets are also extremely vocal, and so they are going to let you know that they are there, and they're likely going to let you know that they're not happy about you being there. I've done a lot of wetland surveys where I'm walking from one wetland basin to the other, and sometimes the willets just get totally up in arms, and I've had them follow me to 3 or 4 different wetlands, just circling around and basically screaming at you. So super, super vocal when they're alarmed. And they do different variations of Willet, 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 or Pill Will Willet, Pill Will Willet. They kind of say their name, which is really handy. So let's listen to a couple of examples. These things are so touchy. Okay. And you can just imagine that going on and on and on and on. They really are very vocal when alarmed. And here's another version. So that one's more saying the willet, 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 willet. And the pill will willet again. Again, this is a bird that you're very likely to both see and hear. So you can use both of those clues together to get at an ID. And especially if they're flying around you doing that call, that wing pattern is really distinctive, and both sexes look the same. For diet, these guys are one of those birds that walks around and steadily just kind of picks, swishes, and probes for food. And they'll eat kind of anything that they can get their little bills on that fits. So everything from insects, crustaceans, small mollusks, polychaete worms if they're getting out on, shore flats, small fish, amphibians like this poor little frog here. um, you know, they're going after all kinds of, animal, insect, and crustacean type food. Here's a lovely photo of a willet stretching its wings. So they will do that. But otherwise, they are just kind of, again, drab, plain, cool gray overall. Gray legs, gray bill, gray body. And of course, shorebird babies are some of the most adorable babies on the planet. And here is a little willet. So I think they're very cute. Willets have a disjunct distribution. We've got the western subspecies out west, and the eastern species is along kind of the eastern seaboard and maritime provinces out east. The other kind of sort of similar shorebird is the marbled godwit, similar in size, maybe a little bit larger than the willet. This bird has warm brown tones overall, and it's got a little bit more going on in terms of, coloration. So they do have a long, slightly upturned bill that kind of starts off as orangey pinkish and fades to dark. So bicolored, definitely has two tones to the bill, and the face has this kind of paleness to it with a dark line that goes kind of in between the eye and the bill, or you can think of it as kind of an extended eyebrow stripe. But there is pale at the base of the bill as well. Overall, the body coloration is a warm brown. It's not cool gray. It definitely has some of those kind of richer, sort of orangey reddish tones to it. And especially in flight, the underwings are mostly this kind of rich cinnamon color, so it really does flash really warm brown tones as they're getting up and flying. That bill, quite distinctive. It's a fairly long bill, and there is a slight upturn to it, but that nice two-tone, that kind of orangey and black at the tip. This is another one that is extremely vocal. They will follow you to maybe fewer wetlands, but similar to the willet, they're going to be, for the most part, alerting absolutely everyone to your presence if you're kind of nearby within view of them. So it's another one, very vocal, and it's another namesayer, and they often do variations of Godwit, Godwit, Godwit. Let's listen to them. It really does kind of sound like it's screaming at you, and I assure you that it is. Let's listen to it once more. I do love them. Both marble godwit and willet, they'll actually nest in upland habitat and then bring their little kids down to a wetland area. So you're going to find them in areas that have some upland habitat nearby and wetlands. So, if you've ever been on a great big, native pasture, you'll often find, godwits and willets out on those, because all of that native vegetation is much better for them to nest in than kind of roadside ditches, or sometimes have them wandering around stubble fields. So very handsome birds. Let's take a look and see a little bit more about their flight feathers. So they're another one very similar to the willet. They're going to walk and steadily pick, probe, and pick foods. They do spend a bit more time in the upland, and they do eat a fair number of grasshoppers, as it turns out. They'll also eat some aquatic plant tubers, and as well as leeches and small fish. You can see from these photos, you can really see kind of the warm tones of the wing. A little bit of a dark wedge on the upper part of the wing, but for the most part, it really does stand out. They go up and they fly, and it's like, ooh, that is quite the cinnamon tones to the wing. So very handsome little bird, or large-ish bird, but they will be screaming at you. They definitely are very vocal and not super thrilled about your presence for the most part. Marble godwits, really, they have quite most of their distribution is in the northern Great Plains. There's a little bit, in Alaska and in northern Ontario, but the core of the distribution is on all of those, pothole wetlands on the prairie habitat. Let's compare those two side by side. Marble godwit on the left, willet on the right. Marble godwit, that longer upturned bill, two-toned, and then there's actually some patterning going on the face. There's that kind of line between the eye and the bill, kind of whitish contrasting eyebrow stripe. The willet, really kind of just plain, mottled, light, kind of cool gray overall. Has a long bill, but if you ever see the two side by side, it really looks like a short bill. So it's still longish, straight bill, gray, little bit of an eye ring there, just very faint. gray legs overall. The legs in the marble godwit tend to be a little bit darker, but oftentimes they're covered in muck, so it's hard to tell anyway. And in flight, especially, the willet really flashes those bright black and white patterns in the wings, and the marble godwit has those kind of warm cinnamon brown tones. So they're a nice study in kind of warm browns and cool grays. I think they're really, I really like both of them. They're quite handsome. I say that about all the species I know. I really do like them. Okay, so we've made it to the end, and this is one of the, potentially one of the more challenging sessions because there are so many pairs that look, quite similar. And I put this one at the end of of the series for a reason. I don't want anybody to, start off going, oh, good grief, all of these birds look the same. So we've got our Marsh Wren and our Sedge Wren pair here together. Marsh Wren's warmer brown overall, Sedge Wren more of a straw colored. Marsh Wren has that nice white contrasting eyebrow and that kind of patch of non-barring on the wings. Sedge Wren, low contrast overall. There is a little bit of an eye stripe, but it doesn't contrast highly with the rest of its face, and it's very stripy all over the wing. So Marsh Wren has that variable gurgling rattle. And I promise you, if you listen to enough of them, it will start to sound musical compared to the more mechanical Sedge Wren, which has a couple of intro notes and that kind of harsh sewing machine rattle. Our common yellowthroat, the male has that really gorgeous dark mask, which definitely stands out a long distance. Of course, that gorgeous yellow throat, but the thing that really kind of catches your eye is that dark bandit mask. And they sing a witchity, witchity, witchity. The northern harrier is going to be the most commonly seen raptor in the wetlands, and that kind of white rump patch at between the body and the top of the tail, nice bright white in both sexes. And it's going to be the raptor that's really just kind of cruising low over fields and wetlands, and they're largely silent. I didn't mention that before, but that's why we're not listening to any of their calls, because it's not something that's useful or that you're likely to hear. Of course, our two terns, common and Forsters. Common has the continuous coloration on the back, Forsters does the fade. Perched common tern has dark primary feathers and a shorter tail. Forster's has those kind of silvery primaries that show up really nice and pale as they're perched, and has a tail that extends past the tip of the wing, so longer than the wing tips. Sounds, the common tern does a two-parted kee-er. Whereas the Forster's does more of a keer. I'll play that one more time. And of course, the willet that we just covered, bold flashes of color, especially when it's flying around, and you are definitely going to be hearing it, so let's listen to those. They do pill will willet and variations of willet. And the more simple willet. Hey. I don't know why it's being terrible. I'll play it again. And the marble godwit, that nice two-toned bill, warm cinnamon wings, warmer brown overall. Definitely doing variations of Godwit, Godwit. Maybe sounds a little bit more deranged than the willet. And that's it for the evening. My name is Leanne Latchmoy. You can shoot me a note anytime at llatchmoy@birdscanada.org. You can visit the MarshWatch homepage. There you're going to find other quizzes, all of the recordings, as well as links to recordings from last year as well. Birds Canada, you can find us on all of the socials, or most of the socials. There seems to be a lot more. I'm bad at social media. I'm glad we have a team that does those sorts of things. We are a national not-for-profit. We're a registered charity, and I hope you consider us in your giving portfolio if you're in a position to give. I'd like to say a big thank you to the financial supporters of MarshWatch. Those are the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, and the Wildlife Habitat Canada. And thanks to all of you for coming out and tuning in again.